So thank you for all attending. This is the ASI Complaints Mechanism webinar, and we'll provide some updates and an illustrative case study. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge Indigenous people and local community representatives and the lands on which we all operate with Indigenous people and local communities. So welcome to the ASI Complaints Mechanism webinar, and we'll have a discussion about why we're here, how we've worked through the review process of the ASI Complaints Mechanism. So in 2015, ASI had the first complaints mechanism to provide a means for aggrieved people to use in regard to ASI's standard setting process. In 2023, ASI completed a review of its complaints mechanism, and that included some internal and external legal review. That resulted in a redrafting of the ASI complaints mechanism, supported by inputs from ASI Secretariat staff and ASI board members. That subsequent draft was further reviewed by international experts on complaints mechanisms that also included review by Indigenous People Advisory Forum members. In February 2024, the ASI board adopted the resulting draft, version 4 of the ASI complaints mechanism. This webinar will go through the updated version 4 ASI complaints mechanism and highlight some of the fundamental principles and practical applications of the mechanism. We'll also have a bit of a discussion about how it interacts with entity-based complaints mechanisms, or as some call them, grievance mechanisms. And within this webinar, we'll also consider some hypothetical case studies to tease out some of the process and help generate some discussion. So now I'd like to hand over to Leo Karlowitz, who will go through the core of the ASI complaints mechanism.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. Thanks to ASI for having me as an independent consultant to all of this. And when looking at the complaints mechanism, let's start with who can make a complaint. And the answer is very easy: anyone. And anyone is in particular rights holders and stakeholders, and that is Indigenous peoples, affected communities, workers, NGOs, and the like. But it is also parties like ASI members and the employees, ASI auditors, any organization or individual who might be aggrieved. Next slide. What is the ASI complaints mechanism about? It is essentially about the ASI standard setting process and the certification program, or better, complaints related to that. And that means that while anyone can lodge a complaint, complaints should be about ASI, about membership or certification or accreditation, or the conduct of either ASI itself, ASI members, accredited auditors or audited firms, or accredited registered specialists. Next slide, please. Now, when claims are received, ASI will carefully review all of them and respond to every complaint following a certain time frame. The initial acknowledgement of receipt will be done in 5 days. And the main aim is to understand the issues, to find an appropriate and case-tailored solution for resolving them. And for that, there is quite a detailed complaints process that includes a toolbox of measures and has various potential outcomes, at which we will look in a second. But before that, just the reminder and the acknowledgement that all claims are, of course, treated confidentially and will be anonymous if this is requested by the claimant or deemed appropriate. Next slide, please. Now let's look at the complaints mechanism. If a complaint is received, as said, ASI will listen to you and to understand, and will try to understand the issues, may raise follow-up questions, and generally get involved and hear about your experience and perspectives. This may also relate to legacy and historical issues, even though they are not sort of at the core of the complaints mechanism, which focuses mostly on audits that take place at a given time. One of the issues that will be looked at the beginning is in how far you or the claimant has already gotten into contact with the respondent from the outset. Ideally, a claim should, of course, be lodged first to the respondent, and there the respondent's grievance mechanism should have been used first. But of course, we realize that this is not always be possible or appropriate, for example, because of fear of retaliation. Now, once a complaint is received and also found admissible by ASI, then there are a series of different options, and we call that the toolbox. The toolbox, because unlike in the version before, we do not see this complaints mechanism as a linear process, meaning you need to start with a dialogue and then eventually investigation will happen and a decision will be made. But the various elements are used interchangeably and on an equal footing. And the first one would be a dialogue process or a mediation. And that is important because the ASI or the aim of the complaints mechanism of ASI is, among others, engagement and improved relationships. And that puts dialogue and mediation at the very fore of the complaints mechanism. Might say other aims of the complaints mechanism are generally an improvement of the standards, so learning through complaints, but also, of course, the remedy aspect. If a grievance has happened, it should be remedied. Now, dialogue is one. The next one would be the referral back to an auditor or flagging the issue for the next audit. If the whole thing becomes more complicated, ASI would either investigate the case itself or commission an external investigator. We call that person assessor, and that might be an individual or a panel with the task to look into the issue more in depth. Of course, follow due process, meaning stick to principles of procedural fairness, listen to both parties, acknowledge and review the evidence provided by both, possibly consulting independent further third experts, consult technical expertise, review available literature, and maybe also commission further audits. The whole thing will be done in very close collaboration with the so-called ASI Complaints Officer, and that is the person in ASI and the ASI Secretariat commissioned with managing and handling the case. And for all of this, particular timelines are either set or will be agreed upon in the process. Next slide, please. There are not just various sort of measures that can be taken, approaches to kind of arrive at a decision, but there are also various of outcomes available. One, and we find the most ideal, would be the resolution of the case of the issue through dialogue or mediation, possibly facilitated through ASI. But of course, ASI may also decide directly on a complaint, either in favor or against the claimant, or it may refer the matter back to the auditor and or to the next scheduled audit. And allow me a few remarks on the relationship between auditing and the complaints mechanism. Because it is, in principle, the auditor who is responsible for fact-finding and the assessment of conformance and non-conformance, and not necessarily the investigator or the assessor. The complaints mechanism is not supposed to function as a surrogate audit, and that means that ASI cannot substitute the decision by the auditor. But of course, ASI does assurance oversight, and that means reviews the report of the auditors and also related evidence, can determine a critical breach that is a breach of the ASI performance standard that is particularly critical and serious, and if the knowledge is in the public domain, and that would in the end trigger disciplinary action, for example, like a cessation of an audit, or a suspension of membership, or a withdrawal of auditor accreditation. So all of this can happen. But generally, as said, it is the auditor who goes into the entity and checks the situation on the ground, who is the main fact finder. We can go into that in more detail. Another, of course, possibility to outcome of a claim may be a corrective action plan that can be developed jointly by the parties or ordered by ASI, of course, after hearing the parties and judging what would be feasible and what not, all in a given timeline, and it would be also monitored by ASI. And I already mentioned the disciplinary proceedings or the sanctions against a member or accredited auditor. ASI would report on all of this, of course, observe confidentiality. A summary report would go to the ASI board, and a shorter version put on the ASI webpage. And there are, if a party isn't okay with a finding, the possibility to launch an appeal against the loss of membership, certification, or accreditation, and the complaint can do so if a serious physical or mental harm is alleged and involved in the case. Next and last slide, please. Now, we do encourage you to make use of this complaints mechanism, and there are various ways to do so and to enter into contact with ASI. The first and maybe the easiest would be an initial inquiry through the email addresses and the phone number provided. Indigenous peoples have the advantage of making use of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum, IPAF, for which Mark is the principal advisor at ASI. This is a forum particularly set up to support Indigenous peoples in ASI-related matters and participation. But of course, you can also use an anonymous helpline called Ethics Point Portal, managed by an independent service provider, Navex, and available in 5 different languages besides English and French. This is Portuguese, Chinese, and German. Or you trust the translation services of ASI and make a complaint directly to ASI. We do have or ASI does have its translation facilities as well, and launch a complaint directly by using the forms and formulas on the ASI webpage. This is it for me. Thank you very much. And I hand over to you, Jessica.
Thank you, Leo. So we will now cover a hypothetical case study to show how our complaints mechanism operates, as well as the type of complaints that we may receive. So just to say, both the company and the tribe are made up in this. However, the claims are realistic claims. So a little background for this. As a result of bauxite mining activities conducted by ASI Certified Mining Corporation, Bauxco, an indigenous community known as the Koro Tribe were resettled. The Koro Tribe has historically inhabited the region. Their tribal lands provide for all of their needs. To live and prosper, the land is managed through complex cultural practice and intimate ecological knowledge. The resettlement agreement stated that the quality of land would be equal in the new location. So this case study highlights 3 separate issues. Firstly, a complaint from the Koro Tribe representatives stating that they believe the auditor's consultation was insufficient and therefore did not highlight two pending issues concerning financial compensation and soil quality that the Koro Tribe have faced over the past year. These issues have been affecting social dynamics as well as health, well-being, and income. So, for the first issue, the Koro Tribe representatives submitted a complaint to ASI against an auditor, stating their concern that a recent audit for Bauxco mine was inadequate. This is because the audit was done too quickly and there was not enough engagement between the auditor and the community. The auditor did not understand the full and direct negative impacts caused by Bauxco on the Koro community. The auditor did not speak with women and some of the elder men who have the knowledge of medicine plants. Therefore, they were distressed to see that the audit report did not show all of these facts. Even the facts that were heard were not properly recorded, as the auditor stated that there were no non-conformances. The complainants believe there were many non-conformances and some of them major. So, what is ASI's response? When receiving the complaint, ASI acknowledged the complaint of the Koro representatives within 5 working days. ASI asks the Koro representatives if they would like to remain anonymous, which they will for now. The ASI Secretariat IPAF advisor confirmed that ASI will begin an investigation, and this will start by meeting with the ASI assurance team to get some information and background on the audit. ASI will then contact the auditor to raise the issues identified, discuss the audit report with them, and ask them to comment. ASI would explain the process and timeframes to the complainant. They also recognize that these complaints are linked to 2 other complaints made by community members based on conduct by Bauxco. So then we go to our next issue, which is the unpaid compensation. A number of Koro community members submitted a joint complaint to ASI that they have not received their financial compensation from Bauxco that was agreed as part of the resettlement agreement. 6 months have passed since they were supposed to receive payment. However, Bauxco said they have paid the agreed compensation. However, Bauxco did not highlight their complaints mechanism, so no formal complaint was raised. In this instance, Bauxco has not followed due process. In the resettlement agreement, it was clear that each community member would receive compensation. However, Bauxco gave financial compensation to a select few people who falsely claimed to represent the community. Bauxco now claim they have fulfilled their duty. Bauxco should have engaged in continued dialogue with the Koro Tribe representatives to properly address the concern and explain the formal complaints process. They should have undertaken a formal review, confirmed timeframes of the review, and work with the community to confirm agreed solutions. So, what is ASI's response? ASI acknowledges the complaint has been received within 5 days and confirms they will begin an investigation. ASI begins by contacting Bauxco, raising these concerns and offering to work with them to address these challenges to ensure that the complainant's concerns are fully addressed through proper procedure. Due to the nature of the complaints, ASI would propose that the ASI Complaints Officer or IPAF advisor facilitates a meeting between Bauxco and the Koro representatives. If the company disputed the Koro representatives' interpretation of the agreement payment requirements, ASI would seek commitment from the company to pay for the Koro representatives to have independent legal advice on this matter. Other actions to address this matter include logging the complaint, so during the next audit cycle, the auditor responsible will focus their attention on this issue and the specific complaint issues. If this issue is not resolved, it may be considered a more serious breach of the ASI performance standard and trigger an out-of-cycle audit. So we are coming to our final issue and probably the most serious of the 3. So initially, Bauxco engaged in a dialogue process to address concerns regarding the impact of resettlement from the Koro Tribe's ancestral lands to the new resettlement area. And Boxco assured the community that the soils in the new location were just as good as their previous location, and that the company would provide additional measures to enrich the soil and make it more productive than their traditional village. However, as mining operations continue, tensions escalate due to the lack of communication from the company and perceived inadequate compensation for insufficient farming lands under the agreement. The Koro Tribe representatives decided to engage in a formal complaints process with Boxco, but have been unsatisfied with the process and outcome, therefore submit a complaint to ASI. The complaint outlines their concerns with the resettlement agreement, particularly the impacts on their cultural practices and traditional production of food and traditional medicines because of the low quality of the new land provided. They express concern that the new land allocated by Boxco for resettlement is not as fertile as previous lands, and as a result, some crops cannot grow, some crops take much longer to grow, and yield is much lower. With some plant species not growing at all, these species relied on for food and medicine. The community say this is significantly impacting their cultural practices and well-being. There is not enough food produced to store for the winter and to feed the cattle. The river in the new place does not have any fish like their old village. The poor land is threatening food security, impacting ecosystem services, including provision of food supplies, and people's health and well-being is impacted due to certain medicinal species no longer growing, and a lack of economic prosperity due to not having enough to sell or trade. So what was Boxco's initial response? Well, Boxco responded that they have conducted an investigation into the allegations. The company acknowledged the community concerns, but says that the challenges are out of their control as it's due to natural factors like the weather and the land. It has said it has tried to improve the fertility of the land, but the community says that Boxco did not listen to them, and what the company did had no benefit. Boxco offered short-term solutions, such as providing food aid for the next few months and temporary assistance. However, the company would not commit to concrete actions or timelines for sorting out the issues of land fertility and food insecurity, and would not listen to the community's suggestions on how to solve the problem. So this was the incorrect response. And we will discuss now how Boxco should have responded. So firstly, they should have let the community know about their complaints mechanisms and use it to follow due process in a transparent way, with clear timelines and particular attention to communications and representatives. They should have acknowledged and validated the concerns of the Koro Tribe. They should have conducted a full assessment with the Koro Tribe and their representatives, and if required, hire an independent specialist to understand the baseline condition of the previous village and how it compares with the resettlement village area, including land capabilities, agricultural potential, water and soil characteristics, etc. Boxco should have involved the community in fixing up the land and supported them with resources and funding to improve the land so they can continue to grow their traditional food and medicine crops for the future. Boxco also should have provided immediate support to alleviate the community's challenges caused by the resettlement, including supplying food aid, medicines, and other required assistance until longer-term solutions are developed and implemented. And lastly, they should have developed sustainable long-term solutions in a participatory way, which may be done through land rehabilitation programs and capacity building initiatives. So what would ASI's response be to this? Well, similar to the first two, the ASI complaints officer would confirm receipt of the complaint within 5 days and begin coordinating an investigation. ASI would begin by contacting Boxco, raising these concerns with them in order to bring the issues to their attention and offer to work with Boxco in order to address these challenges. The assessor, this may be individual or a panel, external or internal, and could include technical specialists, will assess the evidence provided. ASI will then make a decision based on advice from the assessor The complaints will be logged and passed on to the auditor responsible for the next audit, so they can focus their attention on this area. More serious breaches of the ASI performance standard can trigger an out-of-cycle audit. Some of the outcomes of the complaints mechanism could include mediation between parties, corrective action, monitoring, or in critical breaches, sanctions applied. And that is the end of our presentation, and we now come to the Q&A session, where we will be happy to answer your questions.
So there was one question I see now about what is a critical breach. So Leo, would you like to just give a higher level overview of what constitutes a critical breach?
Yes, I can. A critical breach is obviously the most serious breach that can be done to the ASI performance standard, and it triggers, as said, a couple of special responses, meaning in particular disciplinary actions and sanctions. And it also allows in certain ways allows the Secretariat in certain ways to, I don't want to say sidestep the auditor's findings, but basically to take harder measures next to or independent of what the auditor said. And it is defined in the definitions of the ASI performance standard, and it is basically a breach that is critical to the functioning of the ASI performance standard. Where do I have it? Yes, so the definition is a situation identified by the auditor or through the ASI complaints mechanism deemed to be critical to the, that's the formulation, critical to the integrity of the ASI certification program. And it is in the end a whole series of points such as violation of laws, of judgments, serious human rights violations, serious environmental damage, fraud, interesting for indigenous peoples, fraudulent representation of free, prior, informed consent, corruption, and so on. They are defined also in the standard and very critical. Thank you.
Thanks, Leo. There's a question in the Q&A. In this scenario, does ASI have anyone on their team that spoke Koro local language? If not, how did ASI communicate with the tribe about the complaint? Which is a really good question. So if there's a language that isn't spoken amongst the ASI Secretariat, then we would engage a registered specialist with ASI for that local area to see if they spoke this particular local language. If they did, then they would be employed to act as an interpreter. If not, then we would seek professional interpretive services that may speak that language. And again, if it's a very localized language, we may then also seek a Koro Tribe representative who speaks English or another mainstream language, if you like, Spanish, French, or whatever it might be. So we would certainly be engaging and speaking with them in their specific native tongue. So it was a good question. Another question in the Q&A, was the Koro Tribe to be regarded as Indigenous? If that is the fact, then we also have to assess how the FPIC process has been performed. So in this case, it is a hypothetical case. We would consider that they would be Indigenous, and therefore part of the investigation would include whether or not the free, prior, and informed consent process had been applied. So we'd certainly want to make sure that that was the case, Anders, and if not, then the investigation would understand what that was, where the gaps were, and that would provide detail in some of the recommendations. So one of the other questions posed earlier, what happens if a non-government organisation finds out about grave human rights violations of an entity? A critical breach discussion, essentially. So if there's a critical breach, a human rights violation by an entity, and that information was shared by an NGO or other organisation or an individual, we'd want to investigate that as a priority. We would want to understand what the allegations were based on, and we would build our next steps based on the information provided. So it would trigger an immediate investigation, and we would act more quickly than for other types of complaints, which we would respond within 5 days, etc., as outlined earlier. But for an alleged critical breach, we would reduce those timeframes, engage with the complainant, and investigate accordingly. So this question's related to how can this entity be given certification given the many legacy issues? So legacy issues is something that does come up from time to time, and the entities that have been in operation for a long time may have gained certification against the ASI performance standard, and the assessment by the auditor is to look at the contemporary operations of the entity seeking certification. The legacy issues that may have occurred many years ago, if the impacts of those legacy issues are still ongoing, then they would be addressed through the entity's operations, management plans, procedures, policies, etc., and they would be addressed through the contemporary operating requirements. In some cases, legacy issues were a result of government policy, government granting leases, forced resettlement, and there's a whole list of other things that may result from legacy issues. And by and large, those are attempted to be addressed through a number of means with ASI. Excuse me. And some of those might be through the beyond certification projects and programs that are underway. It might be addressed through the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum to initiate a number of projects that address some of those legacy issues. So it's addressed on a case-by-case basis, depending on the nature of that legacy. Another follow-up question in the Q&A. As a follow-up, would the ASI complaints procedure be translated into Koro language, local language? Just wondering how people would know how to complain in the first place. Again, another question, a good question. The issue of being able to communicate and engage in local language is important, and the entity, in order to be compliant with the performance standard, needs to engage with local communities impacted by their operations, or as identified as stakeholders, or have identified as Indigenous people or local community representatives. The entities need to engage with those stakeholders and communities in their local language. So it's up to the entity to undertake those translation requirements. As part of that, they're required to provide information and translation of key documents, such as their local complaints or grievance mechanism. And if any complaints are lodged through that process, then that engagement, that interaction, that dialogue would need to be in the local Koro language in this hypothetical case study. It's an important point, and it is something that it commonly occurs. and it's one that the performance standard addresses through the various criterion. So there's a question here. What can companies do to check if their complaints mechanisms are fit for purpose, up to date with state-of-the-art practice? And what does that mean? So with regard to entity complaints mechanisms or grievance mechanisms, they can compare those with others that may be available online for other entities. They can have a look at the ASI complaints mechanism. They can seek technical or specialist advice from consultants on complaints mechanisms. They could talk to audit firms who may be able to provide some inputs and assistance. They could also talk to their stakeholders, the local community representatives that they engage with on a daily or otherwise regular basis, to see what they think could be a way of improving the entity complaints mechanism, to include the timeframes, the dialogue process, to understand how responses should be provided, etc., etc. There's a number of means of updating and referencing what is a good practice complaints mechanism. So someone says AIM Progress has a grievance mechanism maturity framework publicly available based on UNGP. So that's a good example, and a place where entities and others can reference any particular grievance or complaints mechanism against another mechanism, and assess it for its maturity framework. So someone else says there's also a national help desk on business and human rights issues, and there'd be a whole range of other things that people could refer to and compare against. So I'd like to thank everyone for participating, and look forward to you joining the next of the ASI webinar series. So good morning and good night, depending on where you are.